Chapter 14. Probably no one in Big Medicine that night took particular note of the lambent golden glow being diffused over all the dying sunset. It was not a strong light. Gloom already lurked in the jealousy of crowded ferns above town. Shadows pooled in the depressions and gathered under the wooden porch awnings. Scattered muzzle blasts round the irregular circle of the scattered buildings of the camp, as upwards of a dozen men strove to cut down Pat Stevens in the thickening twilight, began to flash orange. To worsen visibility alone was due Pat's escape from the raking fire turned on him. He had thus far sustained a torn coat and a ripped boot, but no more. But he saw, too, that an increasing fire was concentrated on the stagecoach in which Roy Spain was crouching. Spain was still alive and in the fight, as an occasional gun crack from one of the coach windows attested. How much longer he could last was a question. Perhaps he was already hit, for one of the horses was down, an accidental slug in the head, and the others, seeming begging a similar fate, pranced and reared in fright, while the stage itself rang like a drum from the bullets that tore through its flimsy paneling. The damned fool, thought Pat, ignoring his own peril at sight of a greater danger into which Spain's plunk had plugged him. Why didn't he keep out of this? Yet he experienced an upsurge of warmth towards the young fellow. It was Spain's seemingly hopeless dilemma which had forced Pat at last into what appeared to be wholly a foolhardy action. Slow thickening dusk was in his favour. The men who had climbed to the roofs round about were probing the empty plaza with searching rifle fire. Slugs raked close to the dusty depression in which Stevens lay stretched at full length, but none struck him. Soon, he knew, the renegade gunmen would come running out for a blazing showdown which they'd have him pinned out there in the open. The bold voice of a man on the Bonanza House porch was even now urging this ruthless course. "Get out there and do your job!" The unseen man rumbled authoritatively. A moment later, Buck Fraser could be heard bellowing harsh orders. To shoot a man down in this pink-tinged deception of half-light, without danger of hitting one another in the process, Pat knew would require at least some hasty planning. The brief span of time this required was all the leeway he needed. Hunched up and scraping to his feet in a rush, he dashed straight for the Bonanza House a few rods behind the stalled stage at a zigzag run. Men glimpsed him fleetingly as he burst round the corner of the stage. "There he goes! He's moving!" The deep-throated yells rang out. "Let him have her!" Instant confusion ensued. Guns crashed seemingly at random, evoking further protested roars from various quarters. Pat ran on unscathed and grimly purposeful. Reaching the hotel steps, he leapt upwards and roughly tumbled a big man who appeared suddenly in his path by the unexpected violence of his attack. The red eye of a cigar here in the shadows of the broad porch, curiously unmoved despite Pat's stamping boots, gave him his direction. Rifle presented unwaveringly at waist level, he moved in to the big man that was standing there, and for an instant they faced each other, hard as flint. "Call off your wolves, Redfer," Pat gritted, "or do you go with me?" A moment served to adjust his sight to the watery gloom here under the wooden porch awning. He made out the man before him, burly and big-bodied with bland round face. Not making the mistake of belatedly grabbing for his gun, Brute Redfer possessed undeniable self-control. Fully as conscious as Pat was of slapping feet and confused cries all about them, he raised his voice in an undisturbed rumble. "Hold it, Buck," he ordered cursorily. The uproar promptly died to a tense, waiting pause. Redfer was deliberately reaching out to push Pat's gun barrel aside. "Damn it, I like your style, mister," he rolled out with heavy aplomb. You called our bluff, and we'll drop this hooligan. He stared at Pat, coldly measuring. Throw in with us, boy, and I'll make you rich. Momentarily ignoring this strong bid, Pat waved forward towards the plaza. There's a youngster out there in the stage who had no hand in this, but those boys are trying their damnedest to blast him down. I don't know, Redford. To me, that's careless work. You mean young Spain? Redford chuckled. Oh, he's bull-headed, but we'll forget that. Just call him out, stranger. He's safe. It seemed a cynical generosity at this late date, but Pat was not deceiving himself about the caliber of this man. Brute Redford was indeed the boss of Big Medicine Camp, and with the help of possibility of a dozen cohorts and twice as many siphons, he was able to hold 200 or 300 miners in subjection. He would not, Pat came to the silent resolution, include himself. Walking to the edge of the porch, he called out clearly, Hey, Spain! It's all right. You can roll out. All eyes turned toward the Riddle coach, which stood utterly silent for so long that even Pat feared the worst. Then a disgruntled voice spoke up, with startled suddenness from the shadowy corner of the porch. Nice of you to tell me, anyhow. It was Roy. Pat laughed his relief softly. He turned back to Redford with a bold look. I take it Spain gets a safe conduct from right now, or you and me won't hitch, he informed the big man levelly. Oh, he's as safe as a church, Redford assured Pat. You'd never yet heard a man in this camp to show guts, and by the way, friend, what'll I call you? Name is Stevens. Pat nodded shortly. Fine, let's drink on her, Stevens. Brute Redford turned to walk heavily towards the hotel bar that was down the porch. This kind of stuff is dry work, you know. Pat allowed himself to be escorted inside. They lined up at the bar, and Buck Fraser joined them somewhat sullenly. Other men stared at Pat fixed, striving to read the secret of his cool-hardiness in his expressionless face, but none cared to be identified as those among who, a matter of 15 minutes ago, had striven with deadly seriousness to end his life. Well, Redford scarcely lowered his voice, licking his lips after tossing off a drink. Are you with us, Stevens? Pat eyed him bleakly. Depends pretty much on where you're going, don't it? Brute laughed with a rich, oily humor. So you don't much care if you're rich or poor, huh? Well, I like money just as much as the next fella, especially the feel of it, Pat shrugged. Redford leaned forward. He was much the look, to this moment, a prosperous businessman, a man of large affairs, and if smooth confidence was any citron, by no means even remotely a dishonest one. I know, he confided, as if finding Pat a man after his own heart. Talk's been off the gold standard for some time now, but Stevens, you'll find my word is worth its weight in hard nuggets. No doubt. Pat brushed this aside lightly. Particularly when you're saying hands up to those miners, eh? Redford glared at him briefly. He did not lose his temper, though. My dear man, every man breathing is more or less a crook at heart, he exfoliated mildly. Most of 'em fail to show the courage of their convictions, though. I doubt if you've noticed anything chicken-hearted about me. We're entirely safe here, he persuaded suavely, because I never allow feelings to interfere with business. I replace every weak link in our organization in short order with men just like yourself. It was meant as a subtle compliment, designed to undermine Pat's judgment without his awareness. It failed with its object. It had not taken Pat long to set Redford down as an exceptional blackguard. The crook who bases his twisted philosophy on pure reason is always a dangerous man. Pat set all of his faculties to the task of unriddling the basic character of this smooth renegade. He was the more interested because of some elusive memory that kept circling about in his head, just out of reach, which, once it was laid a hold on, promised vaguely to supply a missing piece to the puzzle with which he had tormented himself for days. He shook his head, as if thinking over the other's words. "I'm no hand to take orders, Redford. I might as well warn you now, though." "Swell, boy, swell." Brute thoroughly approved of this unvarnished sentiment. "I've had to dispose of men who took 'em too easy. We'll get along, Stevens. The big trick is," he went on, with larger insight than he probably realized, "to intend to." "What would the work be?" Pat inquired. "Oh, this and that," Redford shrugged. "Not all our big interests lay right about here. You might have to ride a bit. Time will come," he added, "when you might even get paid off with a check on Denver or Salt Lake." That did it. Pat's eyes widened as something clicked in his head. He was suddenly remembering the sizable check which Ches Denton had urged him to accept in exchange for lazy mare stock. It had been drawn on a Denver bank, and the name signed at the bottom, he recalled now, had been Brute Redford. "Well," Pat strove to sound interested, yet hesitated, "suppose I just roll this around in my mind for a day or two." "Why wait?" "Do you want a flat no right now?" grinned Pat, unyielding. Redford threw up his hands. "You'll come in," he predicted in a tone faintly menacing. "It's to your own interest, as you'll soon learn. But take your own gait, Stevens. I told you I'm partial to your cut. By the way," he rolled his cigar in his thick fingers, inspecting it, "what made you aim to pass down below as Vern Hunter? Why'd you pick him?" "I'm trying to smoke the fella out. Anything wrong with that?" "But what's the object?" "I want to talk to him." "Know Hunter, do you?" asked Redford casually. Pat shook his head. "Is he here?" "No, he's not." Brute was suspiciously prompt, appearing to be preoccupied with some private thought. "I don't know where he is, Stevens." "Could you get word to him?" "I don't know that either." Redford glanced up, arrested. "What makes you think of me in that connection?" "Oh, well, one good turn deserves another, you know. I'll see you around, Redford." The big man let him go, and Pat affected not to notice the glowering scrutiny which Buck Fraser fastened upon him. He stepped out of the saloon and made for the nearest of several public livery stables, where, as luck would have it, he found Spain zealously and grumpily attending his horses. More than one of the survivors needed patching up. "Much obliged for staying with me out there in the bad weather, boy." Pat smiled. "You've been acting the damn fool from the start, Stevens," was Roy's blunt retort. "But I felt bound to string along." "Don't feel obliged to do it again," added Pat dryly. "I won't." Spain was equally cool. "You're better able to take care of yourself than I give you credit for. I only hope it'll last out for you." "This ends here, I think," declared Pat cheerfully. "Unfortunately, you put yourself on record in siding with me, Roy. Just where will that land you with Hunter?" Spain might have fended off this query without much difficulty, but he denied as so much to even try. "What do I care?" he growled. "I work for Hunter. Beyond that, the whole litter of 'em can go jump on a slope." Pat needed no plainer proof that all the hidden threads in this country led sooner or later into the hands of Brute Redford. He filed the knowledge away in his head, having as yet no particular interest in the renegade chieftain. If Redford could be twisted to serve his personal ends, well and good. Otherwise, Stevens didn't feel called upon to haul the outlaw to his accounting. After a few minutes more talk, he turned away. "Where are you going?" Spain called after him. "We'll eat here when I'm done." "No, you won't. I'll be with you in the morning, ready to pull out. Meanwhile, you best just stay away from me." "But Stevens," Roy protested, and starting up. Pat knew the way of this camp and what was possibly in store for him better than Spain would ever do. He walked out without more words. Despite the employment of night shifts at the mines dotting those rough hills, Big Medicine after-dark revelry was hectic. Deliberately, Pat showed himself at the bars, declining to sidestep anything that might come his way. He was the recipient of cold stares of the roughest element, most of whom he judged to have been cheated of their prey. But no hostility offered itself, and Pat had about concluded that none would be when he ran into Redford once more. "Howdy, Stevens." The other man smiled benignly. "I see you're doing all right. Where are you staying?" Pat allowed himself to look surprised. "Well, I haven't gotten that far ahead, Redford." "I own the express mine here at the edge of town," Brute informed him matter-of-factly. "Bunkhouse is in the long log place there back of Munson's store. Go on up there. You might know how to make yourself a room." Pat nodded absently. He knew what was expected of him. After talking briefly of other things he left, it was no chore to locate the express bunkhouse, and he stepped in quietly. Men in the act of retiring paused in their bunks to stare at him in the thin light of the hanging lantern. Even a snore or two broke off, as if some electric influence had entered with them, creating a subtle disturbance, but no one spoke. Ignoring the others, Pat turned to an empty bunk. Buck Fraser stamped in. While he was shrugging off his boots, Pat halted, watching his every move. Fraser glared, briefly growling. "You, huh?" He stumbled out again. Pat rolled into the bunk and pulled the blanket up to his chin, lay still. Silence endured for so long that he fell asleep unaware, and it was not until grey dawn began to seep in through the open door that trouble struck. At first, Pat knew his back was scraping across the edge of the bunk, and he landed with a bone-jarring thud on the floor. Someone had rashed his underbed while he slept and dragged him out roughly out of the bunk. His alert faculties sprang to instant awakeness even as he struck. The booted legs of his assailant could be seen a few feet away. Rolling sharply with the momentum, Pat deliberately smashed against those legs and brought the would-be prankster tumbling down on top of him. Wrapping his arms round the other, he jerked and rolled further. Pat came out on top. His knees came up with a jerk to prop him there, and in the midst of a sudden yelling, he let fly with another fist right and left, and was not astonished, as his sight cleared and focused, to find the bristly face he was pummeling so vigorously was that of Buck Fraser. Buck jabbed desperately at Pat's face, arching his back, and at the same instant an unseen blow from behind caught Pat alongside the head, knocked him sideways. "Get him, Buck!" The rough voices yelling as Fraser scrambled up. "That boy, give him the boots!" Pat rolled and came up to meet Fraser in a slugging exchange. And other men, hopping about in a fluttering underwear, strove to strike Pat. He dodged and ducked and circled. "Watch him! Don't let him get away!" Fraser bellowed. It was Pat's cue. Whirling, he darted towards the door, only to halt abruptly as Buck came pounding after. Sidestepping as suddenly, Pat dragged a foot, which Fraser saw too late. Over it he tripped to go down sprawling in a sliding skid. Pat pounced on him before he could stop himself. Grasping the booted ankles firmly, Pat heaved. To Fraser's bewilderment, he found himself whirling up and around, over through the air. He batted against one heaping, leaping miner, bowling the man over without even losing momentum. Pat let go, and the luckless hard case went hurtling towards the door. His head struck the lintel with a sudden thud as he tumbled through. Buck rolled several yards to bring up in an awkward heap, no longer moving. He was out cold. Pat whirled, poised in sock feet, his grey gaze covering the tensely arrested miners in their place. And for a moment there was unbroken silence. "Anybody aim to take up where he left off?" Pat drawled with a slashing sarcasm. They turned their backs on him, muttering, but ignoring him as he coolly walked over to retrieve hat and coat and to stamp into his boots. With a last piercing glance about and an audible snort of rejection, Pat moved out, stepping carelessly over Fraser's erect form. He took a half-dozen strides and halted abruptly, mouth closed in a thin, hard line. Up the trail from Avalanche, through the chill, mist-shrouded dawn, several saddle horses could be seen coming. Some of them bearing heavily armed men, and in their midst, their hats gone, their arms bound securely behind their backs, rode Sam Salone and Ezra, their scowling faces blatantly advertising their predicament. End of chapter 14.